You can go ahead. So we're going to mark the quilt. There are lots of different ways of quilting, but sometimes for your first quilt, it's helpful to have someone tell you this is how you're going to do it. I'm going to demonstrate some other techniques, but we're just going to do some straight line diagonal quilting. And so the tool that I have for you is called a Chaco Liner, and it's filled with chalk, and it's refillable. You can take it apart and put more chalk in it, and it has a wheel in it. You may, if you're my age and used to sew, you may remember a wheel that you used to mark darts on patterns. So you had like a carbon paper and then the wheel made an imprint. Well, this is a lot nicer because it just makes chalk on your quilt. The chalk is distributed through that wheel. So we're gonna start out doing some of the longer lines. It's kind of a good idea to start at the middle and work out. And you can use your Chaco to mark diagonal lines on the quilt and a ruler. You may choose to just eyeball the diagonal on the 6-inch blocks because they're not huge. If you don't feel comfortable doing that, then you can mark them. But going out into the border, we're going to continue those diagonal lines, and that's probably a good place to mark. So if you just lay down your ruler and just line it up along the corners of the squares, and hopefully they line up better than mine did. I want to bring it all the way out into the border because that's where I really want to do my marking. Then I'm just going to roll this along my ruler, and it's just, yeah, kind of fell off the diagonal, but you get the idea. So it's just laying down this chalk line, and I'm just going to use that to do my sewing. It's a little challenging getting all this quilt under your machine, and so what I'm going to recommend is that you start with one of your long diagonals and work your way out from there to a corner, and then in the other direction, and then rotate it and do the same thing the other way. So the way to get this underneath my machine, I'm not worried about there if I'm going this way, but I'm just gonna take this and roll it up along the diagonal, or along the same line. So this will fit under the throat of my machine so that I can sew down this line. Some people use the clips that people use to clip their pants when they ride bicycles. They're just kind of a clip that goes around your pant leg. Some people use those to hold this in place. But after you do that line, then you can unroll it, do the next line, blah, 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 the way out.
So do you just then mark only half of it and then come back and mark the other half, or do you usually mark it all the same?
I would not mark the whole thing because this will brush off. So it comes right off. And so it's right there, of course. So if you mark too much of it, you're probably not gonna be able to see your lines. So I would do maybe this much of it, sew that, then go back and mark that, sew that, etc. Okay? Okay, I'm just gonna say that again real fast. So I've put on the walking foot, which has feed dogs on both, on the top, which will help push the quilt sandwich through. I have this little sample quilt. It's just a little 16 patch sampler. And one of the techniques that people use with straight line quilting is called stitching in the ditch. So when you've been pressing your seams to one side, you've been creating an upper level and a lower level. So on this block, for instance, this red block, my seam is pressed this way. And so there's actually a little ridge right here along my red block. So the green side is sitting low and the red side is sitting high. And if I keep going, the ridge here is underneath the orange block, and the ridge here is underneath the green block, and then the ridge here is underneath the red block again. So the ditch on, well, let's say on this green block, the ditch goes in the green, then in the red, and then in the green again. So when you stitch in the ditch, you actually run your needle right along that block, and it kind of hides the stitching. So I already have a little bit of ditch stitching done on this sample So right there, if I pull this apart, you can see the stitching there. But when I'm not pulling it apart, the one that's high just kind of rolls over it. So ditch stitching kind of creates a little bit of texture, a little bit of poof. And so I'm just going to kind of demonstrate how to do that. So what I want to do, I'll ditch stitch around this red block because there's no stitching around there. So here are a couple little tricky things. I'm in the middle of my quilt. I'm not at an edge. So usually when we're sewing seams, we're starting out at the edge. We can hold on to the tails and start sewing, and holding the tails keeps us from getting the bird's nests on the bottom. But here I am in the middle of the quilt, and my tail, my bobbin tail, is underneath there. So I'm going to show you a couple of techniques. I'm going to just put my presser foot down and take one stitch right there in the corner. And I can do that with, I just did it by turning my hand wheel. I could also do it just by pressing my foot once. So you know your machine, how it does a single stitch. Then I'm going to lift my presser foot back up, and my top thread has caught the bobbin. And I have two different colors so you can kind of see it. I'm pulling on the top thread and you can see the bobbin thread there. And so I'm going to grab it, and if I was using a tool here instead of my fingers, it'd be a little easier. I'm just going to grab it, and now I can hold those thread tails while I quilt, and I won't get a bird's nest. The other thing is back stitching. So I don't really want to see a lot of back stitching on my quilt, but I do want to anchor this because I don't want this quilting to come out. And so the way I do that is I take my stitch length, which on my machine is right here. I'm going to take it's at 2.5 right now, and I'm going to take it all the way down to almost 0. And sometimes I even just really do. I'll go all the way down to 0. And I'm going to take a few stitches. Boom. And my ditch, my red side is high. So I'm just going to take a few stitches right there, and that'll lock it. And then I'm going to take it back up to 2.5 to sew. And I'm doing my best to stay right next to that red block without stitching on the red block. I want to stop with my needle down in the corner, and this is why the needle up down feature is a useful one in quilting, because I can lift my presser foot, I can spin my block and not lose my position. And I was able to put the needle down without having to turn my hand wheel to get it there. I actually went a little too far, so I'm going to take it back up. So my ditch now is on the red side. The green is high, the red is low, and so now I'm going to stitch down this side. And I do better with my needle on the right side than I do on my left side in terms of being accurate, but it's doing okay. All right, oops. So I just went a little too far, but so I have a feature where I can just push the heel of my foot pedal, and it takes my needle down. So again, I'm going to spin, turn, and my ditch is, again, the red is high, so my ditch is on this little green block here. So there we go. And stop in the corner, spin, and my red block is still high. This one was, it was low on one side. Red block is still high, so I'm going to stitch down that side. I'm off this a little bit again. Then when I get to the end, I need to anchor it one more time. So I'm going to take my stitch length down. So some machines, this one's fancy in that it's got pretty pink peacocks all over it, but it's not fancy in terms of all of its capabilities. I have another machine that actually has a locking stitch on it. I just press the button, press go, and it does like 3 locking stitches, and I can set it to locking stitch at the beginning and the end of the seam, but this one doesn't have that, so I set it down to 0 again, and then stitch, 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 and that locks it. Again, so if I'm done, I can kind of pull this out, and I forgot to bring my scissors, but cut that, and I can now flip it over to get to the bobbin, so I don't have to pull the bobbin up again. So that's ditch stitching. I'm going to just Okay, the stitching that you're doing, the diagonal stitching, I don't think there's any big mystery to that. It also looks nice on, you know, something like this with a 16 patch. So here I did a little demonstration of just stitching along the diagonal. With this, and what you're doing, I can start out near the edge, so I can probably get a hold of my tails without having to bring them to top. It depends on how much extra you left here. You might need to, again, just take a stitch, and I'll just demonstrate it again. I'm just lifting my foot and kind of pulling my thread, and there it brought the bobbin up so I can hang on to that. You're not going to need to do the locking stitch when you're starting at the edge, because all of your stitching on the edge is going to get caught in your binding, so you don't have to do that locking stitch. That's only if you're starting in the middle of the quilt instead. Sometimes I like to set my stitch length a little longer when I quilt. It's not holding my quilt together. It's mostly, you know, it's holding the layers together, but I don't need a real sturdy stitch. So sometimes I'll go like 3 stitches or 3 millimeters on my stitch length instead of 2.5. But so that's that. Okay, so that's straight line quilting, and that could be anything diagonal in the ditch, anything where you want to use your feed dogs to feed the fabric, and you know, you might even draw, you know, a little chevron zigzag or whatever that you do with straight stitching. So the other style of quilting on a sewing machine is called free motion quilting. And with free motion quilting, you have to be able to disengage your feed dogs. On my machine, there's a button on the side that I push, and so I no longer have feed dogs. So all the feeding of my fabric is going to happen with my hands and not with the machine. This foot is I don't remember what it's called. Darning foot, maybe. It's clear, so I can see through it nicely. Can't seem to find the rod to put it on, but ooh, come on. There we go. And it just has, it's spring loaded, so it kind of bounces a little bit, and its job is really just to hold the sandwich together. It's not feeding anything, it's just keeping my, like when I take a stitch, it's not going to let my fabric like pull up off the top. So now when I sew, I'm going to be just moving the fabric underneath my foot to make designs. I am not an accomplished free motion quilter. I like to use the machine to do everything it can. And so you can see the last time I did a sample on this, I just did a very lovely little loop-de-loop. So I'll do a little bit of meandering over here instead. So again, I'm going to need to bring up a stitch, or bring up the bobbin rather. So I just took 1 stitch and I'm giving a little tug there to get the bobbin. And there are other ways of doing that. You can take the top thread and just kind of run it underneath your foot to grab the bobbin, whatever it takes to get it. And again, I need to do some stitches there, but I don't have any feed dogs, so stitch length means nothing. Stitch length is all happening with my hands. I just changed my machine so it'll stop down instead of me having to set it down every time. So the stitch length is going to be a function of how uniformly I move the quilt sandwich underneath my foot. I seldom jump right into my project with free motion quilting when I do it. I do practice on a sample first because it takes some time to get uniform. I have a speed adjuster on my machine, and so if I don't want the machine to go really fast, I might set the speed adjuster down a little bit, but put the pedal to the floor so that it's uniform. So I'm not changing the speed by taking my foot up and down. The speed will stay the same as long as I keep my foot all the way down. And I'm going to just try to Notice I'm sewing in the dark spots so you can't see how bad my stitch length is. Etc. So then I would, at the end, I would do just a few locking stitches right there. That was a few. So I tried to keep my foot all the way down, and if you look carefully at my stitches, you'll see that they fluctuate. When I moved the fabric too fast, I got longer stitches. When I went too slow, I got shorter stitches. So the goal is to just really try to create kind of a fluid motion to get the stitches as uniform as possible. It's also a really good idea to use the same color bobbin and top thread. So my my gray bobbin thread is pulling up through here, which doesn't look great. I maybe need to adjust my tension a little bit, but when I quilt, I always match my top and bottom thread so that you can't see little peaks of the bobbin thread coming up through. Any questions? Excellent. All right, get back to work.